Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're stepping into some really intriguing territory, crossing disciplines and centuries. We're exploring sources that suggest this incredible link between 18th century Jewish mysticism, specifically Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezritch, the Maggid, and, well, modern psychology through Carl Jung, and even 20th century quantum physics. Quite a mix. Our mission really is to unpack this. How could the Maggid's central idea about a unified reality seemingly predict, or at least resonate so deeply with, Jung's psychology and quantum discoveries?
It's a fascinating convergence, and to really get it, we probably need to start with the Maggid's core teaching. It revolves around teshuva.
Teshuva, usually translated as repentance.
Right, but it literally means returning. And for the Maggid, this wasn't just about, feeling sorry for mistakes. It was a mystical goal.
Okay.
It was about reaching a state where Havaya, that's the transcendent, infinite aspect of divinity, becomes Elokecha.
Right, Havaya becomes Elokecha. You mean they become equal?
Exactly. Numerically, actually. The name Elokecha has the same numerical value in Hebrew as the word for nature, hateva.
So the transcendent equals nature. What's the significance of that specific equivalence?
Yeah.
Why does that matter for returning?
That's the core insight. Teshuva, the return, is achieved when our everyday consciousness, our experience within nature, becomes totally infused with that higher godly awareness, with Havaya.
So it's dissolving the separation, merging the infinite with the finite, the spiritual with the physical.
Precisely. It's about realizing that unity in our actual lived experience.
Okay, that merging idea, that sets up the Jung connection perfectly, because our sources point to Jung himself making this link on his 80th birthday, wasn't it?
That's right. He apparently asked, do you know who anticipated my entire psychology in the 18th century?
And he answered his own question.
He did. He said, the Hasidic Rabbi Ber from Mezritch, whom they called the Great Maggid. He was the most impressive man.
Wow, anticipated my entire psychology. That's huge.
It is, and it underlines how radical the Maggid's teaching really was back then. He wasn't just saying God is everywhere, like watching from above.
Right.
He was saying God is the fundamental energy, the energy that animates and connects literally everything, every object, every thought. It's all just different expressions of one single, unified, divine energy.
So everything is fundamentally one. That's the baseline reality.
That's the baseline. And that spiritual truth kind of lays the groundwork for what Jung explored psychologically.
Okay, let's unpack that psychological connection then.
Yeah.
How did the Maggid's ideas about, say, the animalistic soul, the ego, and the godly soul map onto Jung's framework?
Well, the overlap is really clear when you look at how both traditions understand the ego. In Chasidus, the teaching is that God intentionally created the ego.
Intentionally, not just as a problem to overcome.
Not just a problem, no. It's seen as the essential, the starting point. You need that sense of individual self, that I, to even begin the personal journey of transformation. The ego, with its feeling of separateness, exists so that we can consciously choose to move beyond it, to reconnect it to the unified source. It's the catalyst.
So the friction is the point. It makes the spiritual work real personal. Let's maybe contrast these two forces, the ego and the deeper self, or soul, in both systems.
Okay. In both Jung and Chasidus, you have this core tension. Jung talks about individuation becoming whole by integrating the unconscious. Consciousness for him is this dialogue, this dynamic between two centers.
Right, the ego and the self.
Exactly. The ego is your conscious identity, your name, your story, the part that says, I want this, and tries to manage everything.
Your everyday operating self.
Yeah, but the self, or the neshama, the soul, in Hasidic terms, that's infinitely larger. It's the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious, wiser, you could say, and following its own deeper path.
A path the ego often doesn't get, or even resists.
Absolutely. And this tension, this internal conflict, is so central that a key text, the Tanya, written by the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, it literally compares it to two kings at odds fighting for control of a city, which is the person.
Two kings at odds. That's a powerful image. But doesn't that paint life as just constant internal warfare? Where's the resolution?
Well, the goals are different, you're right. The ego wants comfort, safety, predictability. It avoids pain.
While the self, or soul, is pushing for growth, for truth, even if it involves difficulty.
Exactly. The self seems to understand that challenges, even suffering, can be what pushes us towards greater consciousness, towards becoming more alive, more aware.
Which connects to that Jung quote.
Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
That's the one. So the purpose isn't necessarily happiness in the ego sense, but awareness.
That seems to be the synthesis, yes. The goal is to become conscious of these inner dynamics.
And Jung also observed this pattern across a lifetime, right? The first half of life is often about the ego building itself up, career, identity.
Yeah, establishing oneself in the world, but then often around midlife, the self starts to assert itself more strongly.
A famous midlife crisis.
Exactly. But maybe it's not a crisis in the negative sense. Perhaps it's the neshama, the soul, finally saying, okay, enough of the ego's surface-level agenda. It's time for the deeper work.
So that feeling of disruption isn't a sign something's wrong, necessarily.
It might be a sign something is finally going right. It's the call to the real work, the tension, this push and pull between ego and self. Maybe it isn't an interruption of life. Maybe this conflict is life. Maybe it's what we're here for.
Okay, that's a lot to take in on the psychological side. But then there's this other leap. How does any of this connect to, well, physics? How does this internal dynamic relate to the actual structure of the universe according to our sources?
Yeah, that's where it gets really mind-bending. The sources bring in quantum mechanics, which, as you know, completely overturned classical physics in the early 20th century.
Right, showing reality at the smallest scales is weird, probabilistic, counterintuitive.
Totally counterintuitive. You get things like wave-particle duality. Is it a wave or a particle? Well, kind of both, depending on how you look. And superposition things existing in multiple states at once.
Like Schrodinger's cat, both alive and dead until observed.
Exactly. And that observer effect itself is key here. The act of observing or measuring seems to collapse the possibilities into one reality.
Which sounds a bit like the idea of our consciousness needing to infuse and choose or refine nature, like in the teshuva concept.
It resonates strongly, doesn't it? The observer isn't passive. They seem to participate in constructing the reality they observe.
And didn't the sources mention an ancient analogy for this weirdness? Something about the Ark in the temple?
Yes, the Ark in the Holy of Holies. The tradition says it had measurable dimensions, yet when measured from the walls, it took up no space within the chamber.
That makes no sense in classical physics.
But it sounds almost like a quantum description defying normal spatial rules. And modern physics, particularly quantum field theory, gives us a framework for this.
How so?
QFT essentially confirms that the universe, at its most fundamental level, isn't made of tiny separate bits. It's an interconnected whole.
A field.
A single, dynamic, indivisible energy field, sometimes called the quantum ground state, what we perceive as solid matter. It's basically just excitations or solidified forms of this underlying unseen energy.
So the separateness we experience, this table is real on one level, but not the fundamental level.
Exactly. It's a functional reality, an appearance built upon a deeper, unified reality, like waves on an ocean, distinct waves, but all part of the same water.
So science itself is pointing towards this mystical idea of oneness. The distinction between observer and observed even starts to blur, right, if everything is the same field.
Precisely. The field is both what's being observed and, in a sense, what's doing the observing through conscious beings. It provides this powerful corroboration for the idea that separation is an illusion, or at least not the whole story.
Okay, psychology points inward to the self-soul beyond the ego. Physics points outward to a unified field beneath apparent separation. What does this convergence mean for us, day to day? What are the practical takeaways for someone listening?
Well, if you really take this unity seriously, it has profound implications. Think about the mitzvah, the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself.
Classic ethical rule.
But Chasidus explains why it's possible based on this unity. Your neighbor isn't truly separate from you. They are, in essence, another expression of that same fundamental divine energy, that same quantum field.
So loving them is loving yourself. And harming them
is harming yourself. Because at the root, there's no absolute separation. It reframes ethics completely.
And just recognizing this, believing in this underlying oneness that must fight against feelings of like isolation or alienation, right? Which seem so common today.
Absolutely. It fosters compassion, empathy, connection. Because you start to see the other not as truly other, but as part of the same self.
So our personal growth journey, that internal ego-self dialogue, it's tied into recognizing this larger universal oneness. The goal is to live out that unity.
Yes. The challenge is letting go of the ego's insistence on separateness and division and aligning more with that deeper truth of interconnectedness.
So summing it up, the psychology, the physics, the mysticism. They're all converging on this call to experience and embody unity.
That seems to be the message, yes. In our thoughts, our feelings, our actions.
It reminds me of that other Jung quote you mentioned. Life isn't what's happening to you, it's what's happening through you.
Exactly. Are we passive victims of circumstance, or are we channels through which this universal consciousness, this divine energy, is experiencing and knowing itself?
It shifts the perspective from being acted upon to being a participant, a conscious or maybe unconscious partner in a cosmic process.
A partner in the divine mission, you could say. Becoming aware transforms the whole game.
So the big takeaway for you listening is perhaps this: that tension you feel inside, the struggle between your ego's desires and maybe a deeper sense of purpose or truth. That's not a bug, it's a feature. It is the process of life unfolding.
Right.
And incredibly, this internal drama seems mirrored by the very structure of reality as science is coming to understand it, a fundamental oneness beneath the surface of things.
And maybe a final thought to ponder, building on that. If this tension is the process, how do we actively engage with it? The Maggid's tradition, Chasidus, offers specific tools. Practices like sincere, reflective prayer or acts of selflessness. They're presented as ways to consciously work with the ego, not to destroy it, but to refine it, to shift its focus from separation towards connection, towards that underlying unity.
So turning that starting point, the ego, into a gateway for wholeness.
Exactly. It's about how to practically live this unity we've been talking about. That's perhaps the next step in this exploration.